Thank you so much for doing this interview with me. It's very
That's
exciting to
all right.
be with
That's
you.
all right. Now, what are you going to do with it?
So this interview will be posted on the Frankston High School Eco Team YouTube channel.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're just hoping to get as many celebrities and experts that we can get to spread the environmental message and get people engaged on talking about climate change and taking action.
Okay. So how did you get involved how did you get interested in the environment?
Well, I've been interested in the environment for a very long time because obviously climate change is going to affect my generation specifically as well as everyone else. And there's a lot of climate anxiety within my generation because of that. But I am the eco team president at my school. So I am very, very involved.
The last question, how did the eco team become, what made you form and what is the point of the eco team?
So the eco team was formed before I even came to the school. It was already a club.
Okay.
So then I joined the eco team when I started in year seven.
Yep.
And the main purpose of the eco team is trying to make the school and wider community as educated and engaged with climate science, but also as sustainable as it can be. So at the moment, we're working on a single-use plastic campaign. We're trying to ban single-use plastics and
Right.
working on that really is where we're at.
Good. Okay. All right.
Awesome.
All right. Well, let's start.
Awesome. So I just have a few questions for you. It should be pretty chill. I won't grill you or anything, but if there's any questions
That's all right. You
you
do
don't
what you
want
want.
to answer, you don't have to. All right. So has journalism changed a lot since your first days in the profession? And if so, what impact do you think this has had on the world at large?
I think the fundamentals of journalism never change. Basically, it's about being able to identify stories that have interest or impact, interest for people or impact on their lives, and then being able to collect the facts of the story, analyse the importance of the story, and then report it. So that fundamental, I think, has never changed. What has changed is that, of course, where once upon a time it was all newspapers and nothing else, and then radio was added to that, and then ultimately television. And now we've got this whole digital world with so many different social platforms all spreading information. Some of it solid, some of it not so not so solid, and a lot of it completely fake. I think that you see, when I started in 1966 and I started in a small television newsroom in Brisbane, television was very raw in those days. It had only been introduced in Australia for a decade, and in fact in Queensland it had only been going for 7 years when I started. It was black and white. It was pretty rudimentary. Television equipment was incredibly heavy to lug around and cumbersome, and it took a long time often to put stories together. There were no satellites. So if, as indeed happened when I was a cadet in Brisbane, if a passenger plane crashed in northern Queensland, you didn't actually get to see the pictures for more than 24 hours because you had to get a camera crew scrambled to an airport. You had to get them on a plane to that remote area. They had to shoot all their footage. Then they had to get back on a plane or put it on a plane and fly it back to Brisbane. And that was happening all over the world.
Yeah.
The Vietnam War was going on. Australia was fighting in that war along with American troops. And I can remember as a young journalist, the film that was being sent from Vietnam would arrive in a package at Brisbane Airport, and one of our people would pick that up, and the script would be put together with the footage, but it would be 3 or 4 days old by the time it went to air. The world is a much more immediate place now, and in fact, even my generation has become used to expecting and demanding their news to be instant. 24-hour news means often that many journalists don't have the proper time to properly prepare their stories. In fact, because of the disruption, the economic disruption of the old newsroom models has impacted on the numbers of journalists in newsrooms. A lot of journalists have been redundant from their jobs. So newsrooms are much younger. There's much less experience in them. If politicians want to tell fibs or manipulate the news, there isn't as much experience in newsrooms as there once was to identify and recognise what's going on and call the politicians out for it.
Yeah.
So news, if anything, in some ways is becoming less reliable because there are fewer journalists reporting across a wider range of platforms and having less time to properly test the claims that people are making in the gathering of news.
Yeah.
Having said that, there is a wonderful kind of immediacy to news now. So if there is a hurricane or a cyclone in Haiti, where hundreds of people die, the ferocity of that storm can be very compellingly picked up and satellited around the world instantly. So when you see fires going on in Greece and other parts of Europe dramatically, when you see similar infernos taking place in California in the United States, you can see quite graphically a pattern of something that is happening now that wasn't happening 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And you can put that pattern, you can add what happened with our bushfires 2 Christmases ago and see how wide that pattern is. And of course, we start asking questions about why this is happening. And it becomes a very graphic illustration of why we should be so concerned about climate change. So at that level, it has real impact. I think also there is a capacity to make people feel powerless. When people see an issue as big as climate change and as disturbing and worrying as climate change and the existential threat that it poses, sometimes they can throw their hands in the air and say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. So we just kind of pull down the screens on our house and pull down the blinds and try and make the best of our own lives, and we become more fearful of the outside world. It is a real catch-22 news gathering today.
Definitely. And as you mentioned, with it being so immediate and with the social media platforms, I find a lot of fake news stories do get out there. What are your thoughts on the era of fake news and conspiracy theories, particularly those fed by social media?
Well, the biggest worry to me is that on the one hand, you've got this kind of phenomenon that we are still learning how to properly harness, which is the digital age. The social the media, the social platforms that are available and the access that individuals get to those platforms and the manipulation that can be conducted. It can be conducted and is being conducted by governments. You know, you read from time to time about these cyber wars that can suddenly stop a significant industry in its tracks. I mean, an airline can be stopped in its tracks by a cyber war from some mysterious force in another country. So the internet can be manipulated by a country. It could be manipulated by a rogue individual, and it can be manipulated by all kinds of circumstances in between. So we become more and more distrustful of it. But at the same time, because in the democratic world, in countries like America and various European countries, Canada, Australia, we on the one hand I think for a long time we took our democracy for granted, and our democracy is now under stress. And the main reason I think it is under stress is because politicians have lost the trust of people. I know this is all quite complicated, but there are so many forces that all kind of coalesce together to create the picture we're in. Yeah. Again, with the digital age and the age of technological change and revolution, whole workforces have changed, workforce patterns have changed. There are rust belts, what they call rust belts around the major city, where once upon a time, only 20 and 30 years ago, there were those cities like Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and Adelaide were ringed by manufacturing industries with lots and lots of workers, like car factories and so on. And many, if not most of those factories have now disappeared. And those jobs have disappeared, the traditional jobs on those assembly lines for cars and various other things, whether it's clothing or footwear or all kinds of nuts and bolts where people stood on assembly lines and put cars together and various other items of manufacture together. Those people have all been replaced by technology.
Yeah.
And a lot of those people, when they lost their jobs, because the whole world of work was changing, they were finding, some of them, if they were beyond 45 or 50, they were finding that there were no jobs for them to go to in exchange. And so a lot of those people became disaffected and discontented, and politicians who'd promised them that there would be other jobs had let them down.
Yeah.
So this is built up over a long period of time, and it's an important part of the picture to understand. A million manufacturing jobs disappeared in Australia between the 1970s and 80s and into the early 90s. And to the extent that new jobs have been created, they've been in entirely different areas, and many of the people who lost those jobs never really worked again. And there's a lot of angry people out there who feel in one way or another they have been let down by governments. So when they lose their trust in government, and at the same time they've got stuff coming at them on the internet telling them that there are conspiracies for this and conspiracies of that, and those sources on the internet, which often are connected to the companies that are going to lose out if we change from fossil fuels. There are very powerful lobbies which are a part of a process of disinformation and alarmist claims about how massive jobs will disappear if the coal industry, if we phase out our coal industry and embrace alternative sources of energy. So there's a lot of muddying of the science that's gone on. And if you have tried to read or taken the time to begin to read the latest IPCC report, the United Nations report on climate change, which is saying we are out of time now.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are already people at work trying to discredit that report.
Yeah.
It is, for all the good things that have come to us via the internet, it poses to me a real threat to democracy, because it is seriously confusing people about what's right and what's wrong, what's good information, what's bad information, who we can trust, who can't we trust. And in the meantime, of course, the globe is heating up more and more. We're seeing more and more evidence of glaciers melting, permafrost melting, with the risk of methane gases in Russia and up near the North Pole, releasing methane gas into the atmosphere. Every time you see a major bushfire and lots of trees coming down, we know there's going to be more carbon going into the atmosphere. All of these things are happening while governments increasingly are struggling to sell the right kinds of policies that might give us a chance of arresting the heating up process.
Yeah, definitely. It's very concerning where we're heading. So my next question for you is, the environmental movement tends to use the term save the planet, or a fair bit, when they're trying to get their tags and get people interested in reading the stories. I tend to think the term save the humans would be more appropriate. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think when I see 3 billion animals destroyed by those fires, those awful bushfires in Australia at Christmas 2019, they make up the planet. It's not just humans. And we can never stop reminding ourselves. We've always got to keep reminding ourselves what a delicate ecosystem the world is, and how much we rely for our survival on that delicate balance in the ecosystem being maintained. And so when you see, even though Australia's biodiversity was already under threat and whole species have disappeared, to then contemplate the impact on our biodiversity in this country of 3 billion animals being killed in the space of maybe 6 weeks or 2 months, and the kind of destructive effects on the landscape of the damage that was inflicted, before you even begin to think about the human impact. I think I understand exactly why you're saying it, because I imagine what your message is, the message you're trying to unfold is, hey, it's you who are under threat. So I understand what you're saying, but I think I would hate to think that we are so limited in our thinking after all these millennia of civilization that we're only concerned about ourselves that would bother me. I think we've always got to be endeavouring to make sure that people understand that we are all invested in the whole planet, not just in our own lives, and that we all rely on each other.
Definitely. I definitely agree with you there. It has been said you can't have
It doesn't mean that you can't stress the import for people.
No,
But
definitely.
I think we should always be putting it into the context of the wider picture.
Yeah. So it has been said you can't have an opinion on a fact. Yet this is something we see daily in the media. Quite often the media will give airtime to climate skeptics or naysayers whose opinion only leads to misinformation increasing. Why does the media do this, and is it a practice that could possibly be stopped, do you think?
Well, I think you've got to be careful about stopping things in the media because it very quickly becomes censorship. And while I take no joy in watching people being given airtime or being given space in newspapers to spout misinformation or alarmist views or create conspiracies and fears and preying on fear and ignorance in people. At the same time, I think we do have to respect the more important principle that freedom of speech is an incredibly important fundamental in civil society. So I think that is very important. I think also that I think even those people who are still fighting a rearguard action on behalf of fossil fuels, I think that they mostly have moved on from trying to discredit the science because the proof of the science is overwhelming now. It's like the debate has moved on from still trying to create skepticism, if not worse than skepticism, to just persuade people that the scientists are somehow dishonest, that the climate science is wrong or has been overstated or exaggerated. It's moved on from that. And so now those, including governments or individuals or industries that are still trying to protect fossil fuel industries, oil, gas and coal, the push now is more to try and from a government to try and convince us, or from the industry to try and convince us that they are investing in a technology which will somehow clean up the coal and clean up the emissions or store the emissions in some kind of technological way, which will allow us to save the coal industry and the other fossil fuel industries and somehow stop the emissions of carbon into the atmosphere, which will continue the process of warming. And I have to say, and it's a sad thing to say, but I have to say that I think the federal government that we have at the moment is engaging in that kind of stuff where they are trying to convince us that they really do have policies that are tackling climate change in a credible way, when in fact they're not.
No.
And the evidence, if I think part of the problem is that a lot of people find it confusing to try and follow the sort of the science and the technical arguments about what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
But most of the credible science in the world, if not all of the credible science in the world, is that the fundamental ways in which we need to reduce our carbon emissions are just not going to be achieved in the way we are proceeding now. Yeah, and the latest IPCC report makes it plain. And if you talk to any credible carbon scientist or climate change scientist, they are deeply troubled and sceptical about our capacity to restrict our emissions to the point where we can control warming up the planet by more than 1.5% by 2050. And with each year that passes, of course, that goal becomes harder and harder. So the real battle now is around people who are concerned about climate change and really want to understand what's important and what's not, or trying to clear away the confusion about issues. I would say, if you're trying to understand whether a government has credible policies of integrity to slow the process of global warming by seriously reducing carbon emissions, then I think you've got to teach yourself how to sort out who are the credible scientists, who are the credible people in terms of climate policy. You know, it always struck me when climate skeptics would say the scientists are exaggerating. This is a conspiracy of exaggeration. It always struck me, if you had 100 aeronautical engineers and 96 of them said to you that particular plane is dangerous because there is something fundamentally wrong with its design and there have been crashes as a result, we think it would be dangerous for you to climb on that plane. And 4 aeronautical engineers say, that's rubbish. It's safe to go on that plane. What are you going to do?
You're not going to
go on that plane? No, you're not going to get on the plane. And I think that's the kind of approach you've got to take, not just in understanding the science, but in trying to work out when governments are serious about climate change or not.
Yeah.
Look to, and if you're young and you haven't yet got the personal experience yourself, look to those kinds of older peers around you who are going to help you to clarify and to work out who you can believe and who you can't.
Definitely.
Be skeptical without being cynical.
Yeah.
I hope you're too young to have become a cynic yet. I hope you never become a cynic, and I haven't become a cynic, but I am skeptical. And skepticism is a good thing in a sense if it's properly applied.
Yeah.
We just, it's in this world, I think it's really important always to think hard and look hard at what people are saying to you or what information they're disseminating, and build up your own skills at working out what's true and what's not, what's credible and what's not, who has integrity and who doesn't.
So as you mentioned a few times, the most recent IPCC report has stated that we are likely to hit 1.5 degrees of global warming by 2030, which is 10 to 20 years earlier than previously forecasted. While this did gain a small amount of traction in the media, it was soon lost due to reports on the pandemic continuing.
Yes.
Why does the pandemic get so much coverage and the existential threat of climate change so little? And how can we change this so that the climate change does get more media coverage?
Well, there have been times when climate change has dominated the media. And in a way, it's a feature of the way media functions, or journalism functions, or news gathering functions, that there's only so many stories you can tell at one time, and editors of newspapers or of newsrooms on television or current affairs programs like 7:30 or Four Corners, they are making decisions all the time about what people are interested in reading at a given time. Now, sometimes a responsible editor will recognise that even though a story is not going to attract a lot of viewers or readers right at this moment because they're distracted by something else, a responsible editor on a story as important as climate change will still be trying constantly to feature those stories that are updating the bigger picture about climate change. But there are lots of things that climate change is competing with in terms of people's interest. It could be a dramatic train crash in the middle of Sydney, but then that will come and go. But when you get something like the pandemic, which practically, there would be very few people on the face of the earth who can remember the 1918-21 Spanish flu, which killed 50 to 60 million people around the world. And so when things recede in our memory, we forget. This is a totally new experience for us, this pandemic. And once again, we're finding that we can't really trust the politicians because they tell us they have the answers, and then we discover that they're really finding their way just like the rest of us. Yeah. The pandemic is more immediate. Climate change, the challenges of climate change are immediate, and we should be focusing on them now. But we are not living on a daily basis, most of us. Maybe if you're living out in Western New South Wales, you're living with the issues of climate change most of the time. But There are particular periods when climate change will become more dramatic for us again. But when something as strong and impactful as a pandemic, which is threatening us all, is threatening our livelihoods, it's threatening our health. In some cases, people are dying. It is the most important story affecting daily lives right at this minute. And it's changing daily. It's changing daily. Definitely. So that's why I think people are sort of fixating on it, and other stories, even climate change, get crowded out. It will come back.
And on that, the pandemic was something that we were very reactive in reacting to. We didn't proactively react to it until it was a problem. And that's to be expected because we weren't expecting it. But how do we change the mindset of people to proactively tackle climate change before it becomes so big of an issue that we can't actually fix the problem?
Well, sadly, it's actually working to your advantage right now because the impacts of climate change are becoming so more demonstrable and so more dramatic that even people who'd rather not to have to think about it are being forced to by the most obvious illustration of that for Australians was those massive fires of 2019, 2020. And even people who had not given much thought to climate change, but who were being directly affected, people in the big cities who couldn't breathe because of the smoke and the ash, people who lost homes, people whose jobs disappeared and whose businesses collapsed, or because of the fires. And the kind of ripple just on the fires. One of the really most basic things that's happened is that because once upon a time, if fires happened in the northern summer, in the northern hemisphere, the firefighters of California or of Europe knew that if the fire got really bad, they could turn to a country like Australia, and we could send our firefighting planes and all the rest of it, and firefighters even, over to help them. Yeah. And vice versa, if something really big happened here and we didn't have the resources for it, we could borrow from the northern hemisphere. You can't do that anymore because the seasons are now merging. The fires are overlapping. We are about to go into our fire season. The fire season is earlier. It actually started, the 2019 fires actually started in September in Queensland. So the fire burning seasons, the periods of danger are longer in both hemispheres now, and we are finding we don't even have the resources to properly fight these things when they come. They are coming onto our landscape much more commonly. So you don't have to, it's sort of, it's both more evident, but at the same time, there's still some tendency, I think, for people to think, well, this is only 2021.
Yeah.
That 2030 is a long way away, or 2040 is even longer, 2050 is even longer again. And to actually hear a politician like Barnaby Joyce, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, saying, well, it's not affecting, it's by the time it actually happens, we'll be gone.
Yeah.
But humanity won't be.
No.
Our children won't be. Our grandchildren certainly won't be. And one of the points that I've seen made around the latest IPCC report that really caught my attention, because I have 6 grandchildren, is that even though the turn of the next century can seem like a very long way away now, there are people living now. Mm. There are people living now.
Yeah.
who may find themselves 70, 50, 60, 70, 80 years from now, still living and having to try and live in a world that has warmed up by 2% or 2.5%.
Yeah.
Journalists, I think, do have to keep looking for, without being unnecessarily or irresponsibly alarmist, I think journalists do have to keep looking for new ways to illustrate to the broader public how climate change is affecting us now.
Yeah, definitely. So, as you mentioned a few times, community has lost a lot of trust in our politicians, and politicians often get a pretty bad rep. And this worries me because they are the people running the country and making the decisions for the future. And as you said, some people like Barnaby Joyce can make some very interesting statements. And through these politicians that you've interviewed, do they really deserve to be bagged out? Or is it like most things and only a bad few spoil the whole bunch?
Well, no, I don't think it's. There are some standout individuals who are deeply disappointing and are dangerous, and there are some standout people who are inspirational, and then there are all the others in between. I'm less concerned about individual politicians than I am about the systems that produce them these days, which I think are undermining our democracy, because the system is producing politicians and teaching them to operate as a pack. They're told what to do. They're told what they can say and what they can't say. They're sort of regimented behind their leadership. So I think that I personally try not to just blanket bag politicians. It's too easy to do, and it's too cynical. It's too cynical an approach to take. I do think that most people go into politics with the right motive.
Yeah.
Some of them manage to retain that motivation and the passion to do good things, but they are hamstrung by the kind of regimentation of the political process under the banner of discipline, party discipline. But it essentially amounts to them being told from on high what they can do, what they can say, what media they can talk to and what they can't, when they can talk to the media and when they can't. And they are media trained in dealing with the media to avoid the tough questions rather than try to answer them.
Definitely.
And that is a sad development.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're seeing proper, honest, open debate as much as we should in the political system. And that is the enemy, not individual politicians.
Definitely. So I'll ask you one more question. I'm an 18-year-old student who's about to embark on the next steps of my life. However, my generation's future is likely to be impeded by the consequences of climate change. What advice would you give to me?
Well, the very first thing I would say is never give up hope. Never allow yourself to believe that it's just all too big, it's all too hard. I'll just make the most of my life while I can. And I think that is now the great danger with climate change. And I think that, again, those same forces that have been trying to hold back the tide against fossil fuels for decades now have now turned to what I think is a quite insidious line, and that is to say, oh, well, it's gone too far now. There's nothing we can do. Let's just make the most of it. I think that is the most dangerous stage to reach of all. And the truth is, when we see how young people in taking to the streets have invigorated the public interest in climate change, and are refusing to let the adults forget that their responsibility is not just to themselves, but mostly to their children and their children's children, I think that can be quite potent. I would hate to think that your generation will fall foul of that and kind of give up and think it's too hard.
Yeah.
So that is what I would fundamentally urge you. Never allow yourself to be conned into believing that your actions can't count for the greater good, because they can, and I trust they will.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for talking to me today. It was really good getting to meet you and I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
I'm very impressed, Michaela, and it's people like you that give me hope about the future. So keep it up. Thank you.
I'll see you later.
Okay then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.